He stood in the great hall with his shoulders straight and his voice steady, though inside his heart beat with a tension he had never known on any battlefield or in any royal court. The candles along the stone walls flickering as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. And when the Duke finally spoke the words that would change every life present, he did so without anger or arrogance, but with a strange calm that silenced even the soft rustle of silk gowns, declaring that he would marry any one of the Lord's daughters if it meant ending the long dispute that had poisoned their families for years. And the gasps that followed rolled through the hall like a sudden wind, for no one had expected such an offer, least of all the daughters themselves who stood in a neat line, each carrying her own private fears and hopes behind carefully trained expressions. And as the Duke's gaze passed over them, memories from his past pressed heavily against his chest, reminding him that this decision was not born of convenience alone, but of an old promise he had once made to himself after losing the woman he had loved when he was young and powerless, a woman whose face still visited him in dreams. And now, as the lord of the house rose slowly from his chair, his eyes sharp with calculation, the Duke realized that the man before him saw this marriage not as a union of hearts, but as a victory, a way to secure power and peace in one decisive move. And yet among the daughters there was one who did not lower her eyes or shift nervously like the others. One whose quiet composure caught the Duke's attention without effort, her hands clasped calmly before her, her chin lifted not in pride but in resolve. And though he did not yet know her name, something about her presence stirred a sense of familiarity, as if fate itself had gently nudged him toward her. And while the Lord began to speak of dowries, alliances, and expectations, the Duke found himself listening less to the words and more to the subtle rhythm of the room, the unspoken tensions, the hidden desires, and the way this single announcement had already begun to reshape futures. Because for the daughters this was not merely a proposal, but a sentence that could lead to comfort or sorrow, freedom or quiet captivity. And as the Duke reflected on the path that had led him here, he remembered the years of discipline, the cold mornings spent training, the endless nights negotiating with men who smiled while planning betrayal, all of it undertaken to secure a title that now felt heavier than ever. For with power came choices that could not be undone. And when his eyes met the steady gaze of that composed daughter once more, he felt a strange certainty that this decision would not remain a simple political arrangement, no matter how desperately the world around them wished it to be so, because something unseen had already begun to weave their lives together, something stronger than tradition and more stubborn than duty. And even as the Lord finally asked which daughter he intended to choose, the Duke understood that whatever answer he gave would echo far beyond this hall, shaping not only his own destiny, but the hearts of those bound to him by this single, dangerous promise. The silence that followed the Lord's question stretched until it became unbearable. And in that space the Duke felt the full weight of every eye upon him. Yet before he could speak, the composed daughter stepped forward, her movement quiet but decisive, and the soft sound of her shoes against the stone floor seemed louder than any shout, drawing attention to her without effort. And when she lifted her eyes to meet the Duke's, there was neither pleading nor defiance in them, only a calm acceptance that unsettled him more than fear ever could. For he realized in that instant that she had already understood what the others were still struggling to grasp, that this choice was inevitable and resistance would only deepen the cost. And the Lord noticed her movement as well, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with satisfaction, interpreting her courage as ambition. And yet the Duke sensed the truth was far more complex, because there was a quiet sadness beneath her composure, a history of restraint and sacrifice that mirrored his own more closely than he liked to admit. And as murmurs rippled through the hall, the Duke finally spoke her name after hearing it whispered by a servant nearby, tasting its unfamiliar sound and feeling a strange sense of recognition, as if he had carried it with him unknowingly for years. And when he announced that she would be the one he chose, the reaction was immediate and divided, some faces lighting with approval, while others hardened with disappointment or envy. And the chosen daughter did not smile, nor did she bow dramatically. She simply inclined her head once, acknowledging a fate she had accepted long before the words were spoken. And in that moment, the Duke understood that this marriage would not be the simple solution everyone expected, because she was not a passive piece in a political game, but a woman shaped by silent endurance. And as the hall slowly emptied and formalities were arranged with brisk efficiency, the Duke found himself walking beside her through a long corridor lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow them, judging and waiting. And though etiquette demanded restraint, he felt compelled to speak, to offer reassurance or explanation, yet every practiced phrase felt hollow on his tongue, and instead it was she who broke the silence, thanking him not with warmth but with sincerity, telling him that she would do her duty without complaint. And her words struck him harder than any accusation could have, because duty without hope was a prison he knew all too well. And as they reached a window overlooking the gardens where winter roses clung stubbornly to life, he saw her glance outside with a softness that vanished as quickly as it appeared, revealing a longing she rarely allowed herself to feel, and he wondered what dream she had set aside to stand here, so composed, what freedom she had traded for obedience, and whether he had just become another chain in a life already heavy with them. And that thought followed him back to his chambers that night, where sleep refused to come, replaced instead by memories of his first love and the vow he had made never to bind another heart without honesty, a vow now tested by circumstance and power. And while the castle settled into uneasy rest, the chosen daughter sat alone in her room, removing the jewelry placed upon her as symbols of an engagement she had not sought, her reflection in the mirror revealing cracks in the calm she had worn so carefully. And though fear whispered to her in the quiet, so too did a fragile hope, because in the Duke's eyes she had seen not cruelty but conflict, not triumph but burden, and that subtle recognition planted a question neither of them yet dared to voice, whether two people bound by duty could find something real within the walls built to contain them, or whether they would simply learn to endure together. And as the night deepened and the castle slept, both lay awake in separate wings, united by a decision already sealed, unaware that the greatest trials of their union would not come from politics or society, but from a slow, dangerous awakening of feelings neither had planned to allow. Morning arrived with a pale light that crept through tall windows and revealed a castle already alive with whispers, servants moving quickly as if urgency itself had taken human form. And the Duke rose from his sleepless rest with a heaviness in his chest that no armor had ever caused, knowing that from this day forward his choices would no longer belong solely to him. And as he dressed, he caught himself imagining the woman chosen the night before, wondering how she faced this morning weather. She too had watched the dawn with restless thoughts, and across the castle she stood before a narrow mirror while maids adjusted fabric and spoke in low, excited tones, their words blurring together as she focused on steadying her breath, because the reality of her new role pressed upon her far more sharply in daylight, stripping away the quiet acceptance she had worn so well in the hall. And yet, even in her unease, she refused to allow fear to rule her, reminding herself that she had survived years of being overlooked, managed, and measured by others' expectations, and that resilience would carry her through this as well. And when she was escorted through corridors once familiar, now altered by significance, she felt as though every step marked a departure from the life she had known. And when she finally entered the small chapel where the Duke waited, the stillness between them felt different from the night before, charged with awareness rather than shock. And he turned as she approached, his expression unreadable yet softened by something like relief, as if seeing her grounded him in a moment that otherwise threatened to unravel. And they exchanged formal words before witnesses, but beneath the careful language flowed an unspoken acknowledgement that neither was truly prepared for what lay ahead. And as arrangements were discussed and dates set, the Duke found himself studying her reactions, the way she listened attentively, asked precise questions, and revealed an intelligence that had been quietly sharpened by years of observation rather than indulgence. And this discovery unsettled him, because it suggested a partnership far more complex than the obedient alliance he had expected to offer, And later, as they were granted a brief moment alone in the chapel's garden, winter air crisp around them, he finally spoke with honesty, admitting that his proposal had been born of necessity, but that he did not wish their marriage to be a cage, in his words. Surprised even himself, for he had never voiced such vulnerability to anyone since his youth, and she listened without interruption, her gaze steady, and when she responded it was not with romantic hope, but with quiet clarity, telling him she did not seek rescue or affection born of pity, only respect and the freedom to remain herself within the bond imposed upon them. And that simple request struck him with unexpected force, because it mirrored the independence he himself guarded fiercely beneath his title. And in that exchange, something shifted, subtle yet profound, like ice beginning to crack under the promise of thaw. And though neither named it, a foundation formed between them built not on desire, but on mutual recognition. And as days passed and preparations accelerated, they found themselves crossing paths often, sometimes exchanging only a glance, other times sharing brief conversations that revealed fragments of their inner worlds, and the Duke learned of her fondness for books hidden away from view, of her habit of walking the gardens at dusk to think without interruption, while she learned of his early years marked by loss and ambition, and with each shared truth the walls between them thinned, replaced not by intimacy, but by understanding, and yet outside their careful orbit, expectations gathered like storm clouds, nobles speculating, alliances shifting, and the lord of the house watching closely for signs of weakness or advantage, unaware that the true strength of this union would not be measured in influence, but in the quiet resolve forming between two people determined not to lose themselves. And one evening, as they stood together overlooking the same gardens where she had once glanced longingly, she spoke of a future she could not yet picture, and the Duke realized that for the first time in years he did not feel alone in bearing the weight of what was to come. And though uncertainty still loomed, threaded with risk and obligation, there was also the faint but undeniable presence of something new. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of choice within constraint. And as the castle settled into night once more, both felt the strange awareness that their lives, once running parallel under separate burdens, had begun to turn toward each other, not by force alone, but by a shared determination to shape meaning from a promise neither had truly sought yet now could not ignore. The weeks leading toward the wedding unfolded with a rhythm that felt both relentless and strangely suspended, as if time itself hesitated to decide whether to rush them forward or allow them space to breathe. And the Duke found himself increasingly aware of how closely his days now intersected with hers, their schedules overlapping in deliberate ways arranged by others yet shaped quietly by their own choices. Because despite the formal distance they maintained in public, there was an unspoken understanding that neither wished to remain strangers bound only by ceremony. And so they walked together when protocol allowed, sometimes through echoing corridors heavy with history, sometimes through the gardens where winter slowly loosened its grip and early signs of spring hinted at change. And in those moments conversation flowed more freely, touching on subjects that revealed values rather than vulnerabilities. And the Duke learned that she possessed a sharp awareness of the world beyond the estate, an understanding of politics and people formed not through power, but through careful listening. While she observed his measured restraint, recognizing that behind his controlled demeanor lived a man accustomed to sacrifice rather than indulgence. And yet, even as familiarity grew, a tension persisted, born not of conflict but of restraint, because both were acutely aware that affection formed too quickly could become another obligation neither wished to endure. And outside their private exchanges, the castle buzzed with preparations and opinions, noble women assessing fabrics and jewels, advisors discussing implications and advantages, and the lord of the house inserting himself into every detail with thinly veiled satisfaction, viewing the impending marriage as a triumph he intended to display. And she bore his attention with practiced composure, though the Duke sensed how it weighed upon her, reminding her that even now she was seen less as an individual and more as a symbol, And one afternoon, as they reviewed arrangements together, she spoke with rare sharpness, questioning a decision that would publicly limit her role after marriage, and the Duke surprised the assembled advisors by supporting her without hesitation, asserting that his future Duchess would not be confined by outdated expectations. And the room fell silent at his declaration, not because it was scandalous, but because it was unexpected. And in that instant she met his gaze with something like gratitude, quickly masked by composure. Yet that single act altered the balance between them, because it demonstrated that his promise of respect was not an empty courtesy, but a stance he was willing to defend. And later, as they stood alone, once more she thanked him quietly, and he replied that he would not ask her to surrender her voice simply to satisfy others' comfort. And those words lingered between them long after the moment passed, weaving themselves into her sense of what this union might become. And still there were moments of doubt that crept in uninvited, nights when the Duke questioned whether he was capable of offering more than fairness and protection, haunted by the memory of a love lost to circumstances he could not control, and mornings when she wondered whether she would one day resent a life chosen for her, no matter how gently it was now being shaped. And yet each time uncertainty rose. It was tempered by the steady presence of the other, by conversations that did not seek to resolve everything, but acknowledged complexity without fear. And as the wedding day drew closer, the atmosphere shifted, anticipation layered with scrutiny, and on the eve of the ceremony, they found themselves once again in the gardens at dusk, the air cool and quiet, and for the first time silence settled between them without discomfort, filled instead with reflection. And she spoke of how little choice she had believed herself to possess, how often her path had been defined by others' decisions, and he listened without interruption, understanding more clearly than ever that strength often grew from endurance rather than freedom. And when he responded, he did not offer reassurance or promises of happiness, only a simple truth that he would face the consequences of this marriage alongside her, not above or apart from her. And though his words were modest, they carried a sincerity that reached her more deeply than grand declarations ever could. And as night fell, and the castle prepared for celebration, both returned to their chambers aware that by morning their lives would be publicly bound, yet privately still unfolding, and neither could fully predict what emotions would awaken once duty transformed into permanence. But beneath the layers of caution and control there stirred a quiet readiness, not for romance or certainty, but for partnership shaped by choice within constraint. And as candles burned low and sleep finally came, it carried with it not dreams of escape or regret, but of a future undefined, waiting to be written by two individuals no longer standing alone, yet not yet fully together, poised on the edge of a vow that would test not only their loyalty to each other, but their courage to grow beyond the roles the world had assigned them. Washed pale with early light, as if the world itself had been stripped of excess color to witness a union formed not by passion, but by resolve. And from the moment the castle stirred, the air was thick with anticipation, footsteps echoing, bells chiming softly, and voices murmuring plans that had been rehearsed for weeks, and the Duke dressed in silence, each piece of ceremonial attire adding weight to his movements, reminding him that this was not merely a personal milestone, but a public declaration of stability and power. And yet beneath the polished surface his thoughts returned again and again to the woman who would soon stand beside him, wondering not whether she was ready, but whether he was worthy of the trust she had extended so quietly. And in another wing of the castle, she sat surrounded by attendants who adjusted fabric and fastened jewels with practiced hands, their excitement forming a distant hum that failed to touch her, because her focus rested inward on the steadying rhythm of her breath and the understanding that this moment, once feared, had become something she chose to face with clarity rather than surrender. And when she finally rose and caught her reflection in the mirror, she did not search for beauty or approval, but for recognition, ensuring that the woman looking back still belonged to herself. And as she was escorted toward the chapel, the corridors seemed longer than ever, lined with faces both familiar and new, some openly curious, others calculating, and she met each gaze with composed neutrality, refusing to shrink or perform. And when the doors opened and she stepped into the light-filled space where the Duke waited, time appeared to slow, the distance between them stretching into something symbolic rather than physical. And he turned at the sound of her approach, his expression shifting in a way only she seemed to notice, tension giving way to quiet resolve. And in that instant both understood that whatever uncertainties remained, they would be faced together rather than alone, and the ceremony unfolded with solemn precision. Vows spoken clearly, hands joined firmly, and though tradition dictated the words, intention shaped their meaning. Because when they promised loyalty and honor, there was no illusion of instant love, only a shared commitment to act with integrity toward one another. And as witnesses watched and approval murmured through the chapel, the Duke felt a surprising steadiness take hold, not joy in its usual form, but a sense of alignment, as if a long-standing imbalance had finally found its counterweight. And she too felt the shift, the realization that this bond, once a sentence imposed, had become a framework within which she could stand without diminishing herself. And when the final blessing was given and applause filled the space, they turned toward each other briefly, exchanging a look that required no interpretation, an acknowledgement of courage rather than celebration. And the rest of the day passed in a blur of formalities, receptions, and carefully orchestrated moments. Yet within the spectacle there were small, private instances that anchored them. A brief exchange of words amid the crowd, a shared glance across the hall, and later as evening settled and the castle's grandeur softened under candlelight, they finally found themselves alone, not as strangers bound by agreement, but as partners standing at the threshold of a life yet undefined. And the silence between them was no longer heavy but open, inviting honesty without demand. And the Duke spoke first, not with ceremony but with simplicity, acknowledging that this union marked a beginning neither of them had fully chosen, yet now had the power to shape. And she responded with equal candor, admitting that fear still lingered but no longer ruled her. Because within the structure imposed upon them, she sensed room to grow, to question, and to exist without erasure. And as they moved through the quiet halls toward chambers now shared in name if not yet in habit, both were acutely aware that the true test of their marriage would not be found in public approval or political gain, but in the private negotiations of daily life, in moments of disagreement, vulnerability, and gradual trust. And that night, as they stood by the window overlooking the gardens now dark and still, the Duke realized that the loneliness he had long accepted as the cost of leadership had subtly begun to loosen its grip, not replaced by romance or certainty, but by companionship grounded in respect. And she too felt the shift, recognizing that while her future remained uncertain, it was no longer entirely shaped by others' expectations. Because within this marriage, she had been seen, heard, and defended. And as they parted to rest, not yet ready to cross every boundary, but no longer guarded by distance alone, both carried with them the awareness that something irreversible had begun, not the ending of individual lives, but the slow, deliberate weaving of two separate strengths into a shared path. And though the world beyond the castle walls would continue to test them with demands and judgment, within those walls a foundation had been laid, quiet yet resilient, upon which a partnership could grow, not by chance or illusion, but by choice renewed each day. And as the candles dimmed and the castle settled into sleep once more, the Duke and his new Duchess lay awake in adjacent rooms, not burdened by regret or fantasy, but held in the rare stillness that follows a moment of profound change, aware that from this night forward their lives would unfold not in parallel, but in conversation, shaped by the courage to remain themselves while learning, slowly and deliberately, what it meant to belong to one another. The days following the wedding unfolded with an unfamiliar quiet, as if the castle itself needed time to adjust to the new balance of power and presence. And the Duke noticed how subtly his routines shifted now that he was no longer moving through them alone, how decisions once made in isolation now carried the unspoken consideration of another mind equally capable and observant. And his Duchess, too, felt the change in small but persistent ways, from the deference shown by servants to the scrutiny of nobles who measured every gesture for signs of influence or weakness. And though public appearances demanded unity and poise, it was in private moments that their true adjustment began, tentative and deliberate, shaped by respect rather than assumption, and they shared meals in measured silence that gradually softened into conversation, learning each other's rhythms, preferences, and boundaries without haste. And the Duke was struck by how naturally she observed the affairs of the estate, asking questions not to challenge authority, but to understand systems long taken for granted. And her insights, offered without demand, revealed inefficiencies and injustices others had ignored. And as he began to implement her suggestions, he realized that partnership did not diminish leadership, but refined it. And she in turn watched him closely, noting the patience with which he handled conflict, the restraint he exercised when provoked, and the quiet fatigue that settled into his features after long counsels. And she understood then that his strength was not born of dominance, but endurance, a realization that deepened her respect without softening her independence. And yet beneath this steady progress there lingered an unspoken tension, not of distrust, but of proximity, because sharing space invited awareness of the other in ways neither had anticipated, the sound of footsteps in the corridor. The presence felt even in absence, and both guarded against mistaking familiarity for obligation, determined that whatever intimacy emerged would do so freely. And one evening, as they reviewed estate matters by candlelight, a disagreement arose over the handling of a tenant dispute, her perspective shaped by compassion, his by precedent, and the exchange, though calm, revealed the first true friction between them. And for a moment the room held the sharp edge of difference. Yet instead of retreat or dominance, they paused, listened, and reconsidered, and the solution they reached blended both justice and stability, leaving neither fully satisfied, yet both respected. And it was in that imperfect resolution that something shifted again, because conflict faced honestly had not weakened their bond, but tested and strengthened it. And later, as silence returned, she remarked quietly that she had expected resistance, and he replied with equal candor that he had expected defiance. And the shared acknowledgment carried a faint trace of humor neither had known. They were capable of, and as weeks passed, these moments accumulated, not dramatic but formative, shaping trust through repetition rather than declaration. And still the world beyond their walls pressed inward, nobles probing for influence, allies seeking reassurance, and her father watching closely for signs of advantage or loss. And the Duke became increasingly aware of the subtle pressure placed upon her, how expectations threatened to narrow her role despite his earlier stance. And when she voiced her frustration one night, he listened not as a ruler, but as a husband bound by shared consequence. And together they devised ways for her to assert presence without provocation, strategies that balanced diplomacy with autonomy. And she executed them with a precision that earned quiet admiration and unexpected loyalty. And in witnessing her navigate these complexities, he felt a stirring not of possessiveness but pride, tempered by the awareness that admiration carried risk because it could grow into something neither had planned. And she too sensed the shift, the way his gaze lingered not with entitlement but curiosity, and she guarded her own reactions carefully, mindful of how easily gratitude could be mistaken for dependence. And yet, despite their caution, there were moments that slipped through control, shared laughter over an absurd remark, a glance held a second too long, the comfort found in standing side by side during long walks through the grounds. And these moments unsettled them precisely because they were unforced. And as another season edged closer and the estate settled into a new rhythm under their joint influence, both began to recognize that what they were building was neither the cold alliance others had expected nor the romantic union stories celebrated, but something quieter and more demanding, a partnership requiring constant attention, honesty, and the willingness to grow without losing selfhood. And though neither named the subtle warmth forming beneath restraint, both felt its presence, like embers carefully banked, capable of offering warmth if tended wisely or harm if ignored. And as the Duchess stood one evening watching the horizon darken, She realized that for the first time since the Duke's declaration in the Great Hall, the future no longer appeared as a corridor narrowing toward confinement, but as a landscape unfolding slowly, shaped by choices still hers to make. And elsewhere in the castle the Duke paused in his duties, struck by the realization that leadership no longer meant solitary vigilance, but shared responsibility, and that knowledge, both steadying and dangerous, followed him into the quiet of night, where certainty gave way to possibility, and the true depth of their union continued to take shape not through vows remembered, but through days lived and decisions faced together, each one binding them not by force, but by the deliberate act of staying present in a life neither had fully chosen yet now increasingly claimed as their own. As the season turned and the first true signs of spring spread through the estate, the changes within the castle became more visible, not only in blooming gardens and lighter air, but in the way the Duke and his Duchess moved through their shared world with growing ease. And though formalities still framed their public roles, there was an undeniable harmony in their presence, a sense of alignment that observers could feel even if they could not explain it. And this subtle shift did not go unnoticed by those who stood to gain or lose from it, because unity, even quiet unity, altered power in ways that unsettled long-established expectations, and the Duke found himself increasingly reliant on his wife's perspective, not as an advisor bound by title, but as a partner who understood the human cost behind policy, and she in turn learned to navigate the delicate balance of influence, offering insight without threatening authority, a skill that required patience and restraint in equal measure. And yet with every shared decision the space between them narrowed, not by intention, but by habit, and moments that once required conscious effort now unfolded naturally, shared meals extending into conversation, walks stretching longer than planned, silences filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. And this growing familiarity brought with it a new challenge, because comfort invited vulnerability, and vulnerability carried the risk of desire, a force neither had agreed to confront. And one afternoon, as they reviewed correspondence together, she laughed unexpectedly at a poorly disguised attempt at flattery from a distant noble, the sound light and unguarded, and the Duke found himself startled by it, not because it was inappropriate, but because it revealed a warmth he had not yet allowed himself to acknowledge. And he looked at her in that moment, not as a duchess or ally, but as a woman whose presence altered the air around him, and she felt his attention shift, sensing the change without looking up, and for a brief, suspended instant neither spoke, aware that something unspoken had crossed between them, and she broke the moment with composure, returning to the task at hand. Yet the awareness lingered, quietly reshaping how they perceived one another. And that evening at a formal gathering they stood side by side receiving guests, their practiced courtesy masking the private current running beneath. And when a comment made in her direction carried a note of condescension, the Duke responded with a calm firmness that left no doubt of his respect for her authority, and she met his gaze briefly in acknowledgement, the exchange unnoticed by others yet charged with meaning. And later, as they walked back through the dim corridors, she spoke of how often she had learned to endure dismissal with silence, and he replied that endurance should never be mistaken for consent, a statement that carried weight far beyond the moment. And it was then that she realized the depth of his commitment to seeing her fully rather than conveniently. And that realization unsettled her more than any overt declaration could have, because it invited the question of whether she was prepared to be known as deeply as he seemed willing to know her. And days later, a crisis on the estate demanded swift action, a failed harvest in a neighboring village threatening unrest. And together, they traveled to assess the situation, their journey marked by long hours of discussion, debate, and quiet observation. And in witnessing the Duke engage directly with those affected, listening rather than commanding, she felt her respect deepen into something more dangerous, something that blurred the careful boundaries she had maintained, and he too observed her compassion in action, the way she spoke with farmers and children alike, offering not promises but presence. And the shared experience forged a bond no ceremony could replicate, because it placed them side by sighed in the raw reality of responsibility. And when they returned to the castle, weary yet aligned, the distance they had once maintained felt artificial, a habit rather than a necessity. And though neither crossed the line into overt intimacy, the awareness of each other became constant, an undercurrent beneath every interaction, and in quiet moments both questioned whether their restraint was wisdom or fear, and whether the partnership they had so carefully built could withstand the transformation that deeper feeling might demand. And as spring deepened and the world beyond a wall softened, the Duke and his Duchess stood at a threshold not marked by vows or expectation, but by choice, the choice to remain cautious and unchanged, or to risk altering the nature of what they had built by allowing honesty to extend beyond respect into desire. And though neither yet spoke the question aloud, it lingered between them, shaping every glance, every pause, and every decision. A silent invitation waiting to be either accepted or refused, and in that waiting the true tension of their union finally revealed itself, not in duty imposed or power gained, but in the fragile balance between control and surrender, a balance that would soon demand an answer neither could indefinitely postpone.